Hi, and welcome to today's webinar premiere of how to conduct a risk assessment for NIST-SP 800-171 compliance, followed by a live Q&A with Nijel Redrick. Nijel brings over 15 years of experience evaluating and implementing security and privacy controls. His career has related to building robust cyber frameworks and risk management strategies, helping organizations protect against cyber threats. Howard University graduate within mathematics, Nijel holds numerous industry-leading certifications. We are excited to have Nijel share his insights through effective risk assessments for NIST-SP 800-1 compliance. Now, let's get started.
Hello, and thank you for joining me as I discuss how to conduct a risk assessment for NIST 800-171 compliance. Now, while the title suggests the specificity of 800-171, in actuality, this risk assessment discussion will apply to any type of cybersecurity risk assessment. So today we'll begin with what we'll call some basics with respect to risk assessment terminology. We'll discuss the 800-171 Rev 3 requirement to conduct risk assessments, and I will present a risk assessment approach. First, we want to talk about assets. Now, assets are literally anything of value to an organization, be them tangible or intangible. We'll talk about controls. And one of the key takeaways here is that a control can also be a policy. For those of us in the IT world, we use the phrase paper policy versus tech policy. So your actual written policy is considered to be a cybersecurity control. We're going to discuss frequencies. No need to elaborate too much on that. We're going to talk about impact and likelihood or probability. And those two terms can be used interchangeably in the world of risk assessments. And the basis of our discussion is risk. And I maintain that without risk, the entire cybersecurity field would not exist. All decisions are made based on risk, even whether or not a formal risk assessment does take place. For example, when an organization decides to spend about $50,000 on a security tool, they made that decision because they determined there was a risk of something happening. So we don't just make purchases for security devices in a vacuum. Let's say the decision is to stand up a security operations center. That decision is also based on risk. One does this in the Washington, D.C. area, drive around the Beltway one day and say, hey, let me go ahead and ask for some money for a SOC. That doesn't happen that way. There's some sort of risk that has been identified, and there's a need to put together a security operations center. And the topic of today is the risk assessment, which is the process of identifying risk. We're going to talk about different types of threats and vulnerabilities. So what is the 800-171 Rev 3 requirement? So what we have printed on the screen is the actual requirement from the special publication. I'm going to dissect the requirement just to kind of and amplify a few things. First, the requirement is to periodically assess the risk to the organizational operations. Now notice parenthetically, it talks about mission, functions, image, reputation. Notice it says including. It could be anything, any risk to the organization. It mentions organizational assets, individuals, and what we're talking about overall as it relates to Rev 3 is risk to people who handle CUI or controlled classified information, and also those IT products that process, store, or transmit CUI. Now let's talk about a risk assessment approach. The first thing we want to do is to confirm the scope. In the subsequent slides, we will discuss in more detail each of these aspects of the approach. So we want to confirm the scope, list any threats, identify vulnerabilities, analyze the controls, determine the likelihood or probability that a threat will exploit the vulnerability. And we also want to determine the frequency that a threat might exploit the vulnerability. We want to determine the impact of the threat exploiting the vulnerability. And finally, well, not finally, but we want to determine the risk if a threat exploits a vulnerability. And then we generate a risk assessment report. So first, identifying the scope. We begin with identifying the people who are associated with, these are our end users. These are also our IT professionals. There's anybody within the organization, and in the context of 800-171, anybody who is involved with handling CUI. Now, if we're just talking about a risk assessment in general, we don't specify CUI. So our scope, the key here is our scope includes people, not just IT products. Then we want to identify our assets. And we remember earlier we talked about assets could be both intangible or tangible, but not at the same time. So we have CUI, customer data, employee data, hardware, intellectual property, the organization's reputation, that is also an asset, any software in use, and I have some examples from systems here, whether it be the HR system, the finance system, or the research and development system. After identifying the assets, we want to then list the threats. Any threats we can think of that could potentially harm our assets. So here we give a few examples. Deep fake is a relatively new threat in the cyber world, but the key takeaway from this particular step of the approach is you want to research the type of threats that could impact your environment. The next thing you want to take a look at to identify threats would be past cybersecurity incident reports. If unfortunately your organization suffered a cybersecurity incident, you want to go and take a look at the threats that exploited any vulnerabilities that led to the incident. And it's a great idea. I should also say it's mandatory. You want to really compile all threat information that is applicable to your organization. And there are federal entities, there are social media platforms, and there are ample vendors who provide threat information. And this slide here just gives you examples of the types of threat intelligence sources. So that when we start listing the threats, it's like a brainstorming exercise. So we're in project management class, we learned that when brainstorming, there's no wrong answer. So as it relates to threats, you want to list all possible threats just to get an idea about anything that could bring harm to the organization. After identifying the threats, we then want to determine any vulnerabilities. Now, what we've listed here are some sources to help you find any vulnerabilities associated with your systems or where your system operates. Now, penetration test reports are a good source of information regarding vulnerabilities, because when you hire a penetration tester, a good penetration tester, they should be able to identify any vulnerabilities within your organization. Your plan of action reports, plan of action milestone reports. And if you saw the last episode where we talked about how to develop a POAM, so take a look at your POAM reports, because that POAM report is going to show weaknesses or vulnerabilities that have not been remediated. Take a look at past risk assessment reports to identify any vulnerabilities there. Now, many organizations use outside services or service providers. Take a look at those service providers' SOC 2 reports to find out any vulnerabilities that they might have, because any vulnerabilities that your service provider has could impact your organization. You want to take a look at third-party audit reports, especially for the if you were to procure the services of a third party to audit your organization, you want to take a look at that report also. And take a look at internal audit reports. And lastly, vulnerability scan reports. Be sure to take a look at your periodic vulnerability scan reports. And I want to say something here. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations seem to rely mostly on vulnerability scan reports. The problem with that is the vulnerability scan reports will only tell you one, whatever the scanners were able to identify. But let's say there's some IT components that, for whatever reason, are not being scanned. But the vulnerability scan reports won't tell you anything about your weakness in policies or your weakness in procedures. So vulnerability scan reports are not sufficient when listing vulnerabilities. The next thing you want to do is to analyze the status of your controls, the controls in your environment that are there to protect your critical assets. Now, your controls, they have different functions of controls and you have different types of controls. So you have compensating controls, you have corrective, detective, deterrent, preventive, and recovery controls. Now, those compensating controls, I'll go over a couple of these. Your compensating controls are those controls that are put in place in the event that you're unable to put I'll say the preferred control in place or to implement the preferred control. Then you have controls that actually correct weaknesses. We have detective controls. You're familiar with the intrusion detection system. You have deterrent controls. I'll use a pretty practical example here for a deterrent control. Think about people who have a guard dog, and that certainly would deter someone who is trying to physically enter the premises. Then you have preventive controls. Now, preventive controls are controls that just definitely stop an incident from occurring. And lastly, we have the recovery controls, and such controls help the system to actually recover to a working state. And again, those are the functions of the controls. Then we have types of controls, be they administrative, operational, or technical. Administrative controls, those are typically your policies and procedures, those things that you write, that things that people produce. The operational controls, those are controls that those are actions normally that people carry out. And then technical controls are the controls that are provided by the systems themselves. So a technical control would be something like logging you out after a period of inactivity, or locking you out after entering your password too many incorrect times. After analyzing controls, we then want to look at the likelihood or probability that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. So some factors to consider about the likelihood would be, getting back to the controls, the design of those controls and the effectiveness of those controls. Several years ago, when I started in IT, I had a manager who used the acronym TODTOE, T-O-D-T-O-E, test of design, test of effectiveness. You certainly want to make sure that the controls are designed properly and provide the expected results due to their effectiveness. So when determining whether or not the likelihood of a threat will exploit a vulnerability, the control status is very important there, because if a control does not exist, certainly a threat could exploit a vulnerability. Then we want to look at the exploitability of the vulnerability. And that is about three attributes we want to consider. So regarding exploitability, what skill level is required to exploit the vulnerability? Can the vulnerability be exploited by a novice, somebody who just started hacking yesterday? Or is it more likely that someone with 15 and 20 years of experience is required to exploit the vulnerability? We also want to look at the level of effort, the time required or number of people. The less time it takes, the higher the likelihood. The lower number of people it takes, the higher the likelihood. And kind of getting back up to the skill level. If a novice can exploit a vulnerability, that means the likelihood is pretty high. And one of the last factors to look at regarding exploitability would be the resources. Does it take a lot of money to exploit the vulnerability? Or does it take a lot of technology? Probably should have said technology versus technical, but a lot of technology to exploit the vulnerability. And when we talk about financial resources, that takes me back to Stuxnet. When those of you who recall, when I forget the name of the name of the actual location, but there was some type of manufacturing center where Stuxnet caused grave harm, and it was determined the investigation that a large sum of money was required to execute that hack, and ultimately it was determined that it must have been a country that was behind it as opposed to a single person. And the last factor to consider, well, one of the last factors to consider regarding likelihood would be, are there any known exploits? So if you have a vulnerability out there, does anybody know about it? And for those of us who follow cybersecurity news, we hear about these exploits and you hear about these proof of concepts. That's one thing, but then you also hear about actual hackers exploiting vulnerabilities. And next, we want to talk about their frequency. We want to estimate the frequency that we expect that threat or threats will exploit the vulnerability, and that estimate could be it should be based on previous incidents. You don't want to just kind of throw a number out there. It should be based on what you've read. It should be based on your current environment. But you do want to make sure that you take into account the frequency of exploitation. Next, we talk about the impact of the threat exploiting the vulnerabilities. And we want to know about the impact to people and also to assets. Now, the impact of people, because remember, people are the most important part of an organization. So we want to determine what would be the impact to our people. And then we also want to think about the impact to our reputation, impact to CUI, impact to employee data, impact to IT components. Now, this decision about impact should not be done in isolation. I recommend that it be a group project. Get all stakeholders in the room to discuss how they feel the impact would be if a threat exploited a vulnerability. After determining the impact, we're now ready to calculate the risk. There are two types of risk determinations, one being qualitative, the other being quantitative. So here, I've given you an example of a risk level matrix, which you can find in NIST Special Publication 830. This actually was published back in 2002. So in this matrix, if we think about the left column represents the threat likelihood, and the top row represents the impact. So if we determine that the likelihood is low, meaning the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability is low, and we determine that the impact is low, where the intersection of those two would represent low. So that's the way you would read that risk level matrix. As I mentioned a few moments ago, there's a second type of a risk calculation or risk determination, and that would be a quantitative approach. So here I've provided 4 examples. I'm not endorsing either. When it comes to risk calculation, it is up to the organization to choose the one that best fits them. So first, you're given a pretty basic risk calculation formula, just where risk equals the likelihood. And we talked about that, how likely it is that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. And then we have multiply that by a vulnerability, or by the vulnerability, and then by the impact of the threat exploiting the vulnerability. And that risk formula is somewhat qualitative in that you would have to assign values for likelihood, you would assign values for vulnerability, you would assign values for the impact. And then we have 3 additional risk calculation methods. do consider researching each of those to determine which one is more appropriate for your organization. And after calculating the risk, we then want to uh, name the risk or apply a risk level. And typically it's influenced by the risk appetite. Now, again, this should be a group um, project. What we don't want is just one person in isolation determining whether or not a risk is negligible, for example. Um, we want the same stakeholders who were talking about the impact, we want them in the room again to talk about the different risk levels. So I'll briefly discuss these risk levels. So notice, and actually I have them listed from least severity to the greatest severity. Start with negligible, but notice I did not start with no or none. In cybersecurity, we rarely say there's no risk. I can't think of an instance when there is no risk. I guess if a business just shuts down, then of course the risk goes away. But as long as a business is in operation, there is some degree of risk. So we say that a risk is negligible if it's really unlikely that a threat exploit that vulnerability. Um, and even if the threat did, the impact is very minimal. And then we have low. Um, so here we're saying that the probability is relatively low that a threat could exploit the vulnerability. And even if it did, the impact is minimal. Next, we get to medium. Now, with the medium risk, um, we're saying now that it's pretty likely that the threat could exploit that vulnerability. And if that does happen, that could cause severe damage to a mission critical asset. Next, we get to high. Now, with a high risk, we're saying it is very likely that a threat could exploit the vulnerability. And when that happens, we're saying that there could be severe or catastrophic damage to one or more mission critical assets. Now, the distinction there between medium and high is that we have catastrophic damage to one or more mission critical assets. And again, it's very likely that the threat could exploit that vulnerability. And lastly, we have critical. Now, critical is very likely, just like high, very likely that the threat could exploit the vulnerability. And the difference here is now the potential is to cause harm to people. So that certainly makes that vulnerability critical. And then also the that threat exploiting that vulnerability could cause severe or catastrophic damage to multiple mission critical assets. And the last step in our approach is the reporting. So after we have identified the risk associated with the different threats that could exploit vulnerabilities, we're ready to develop a risk assessment report. So the first step is to develop a draft risk assessment report. After that draft is completed, there needs to be a quality control review. And if there are any updates to be made based on that quality control review, that risk assessment report should be updated and finalized. And upon finalization, that report should be distributed to only authorized personnel. Because keep in mind, that report includes the critical assets, which should not be public knowledge. It includes any threats, and threats are not, those can be public knowledge because that's more of a, you don't, I'm not saying to publish your threats, but I'm just saying it's not as critical to keep under lock and key as your assets. It's your threats, but also your vulnerabilities are listed in your risk assessment report. You do not want to have your vulnerabilities in the wrong hands. And then certainly the impact. You don't want anybody to know your impact because imagine somebody knowing your weak spots, right? And how you feel about those weak spots. You don't want that information. So ultimately, what I'm saying is that risk assessment report should only be disseminated to authorized personnel who have a need to know. Well, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the live Q&A. Hello, and welcome to the live Q&A. So let's get to some questions. Let's see, the first question: how frequently should risk assessments be conducted or updated? The 800-171 requirement says periodically. Certainly that's vague. Um, the organization should conduct a risk assessment in accordance with organizational policy. That's number one. In addition to that, the recommendation is to conduct risk assessments anytime a security control changes or as a result of some sort of incident. As far as updated, because that kind of goes in line with that, you want to update your risk assessment based on changes within the environment. So, as I mentioned, if a security control changes, you want to update the risk assessment. If the organization suffers some sort of incident, you want to update the risk assessment. But let's say there are no changes, which is rare. Let's say there are no incidents, then conducting a risk assessment annually is normally sufficient. Next question: what is the process for mitigating a finding after conducting a risk assessment? During our last webinar, we talked about developing a SMART plan or SMART plan of action and milestones. Um, that plan of action and milestones, that approach that is your process for mitigating the finding. Let's see, next question. With the recent updates in this special publication 800-171, how do you see the shift impacting our approach to threat modeling, and what adjustments should we make to stay ahead in both compliance and security objectives? Wow, that's a lot to unpack there. So I'll reread that. With the recent updates in this special publication 800-171, how do you see the shift impacting our approach to threat modeling, and what adjustments should we make to stay ahead in both compliance and security objectives? I'll break that question up into two parts. First, regarding threat modeling. Threat modeling is normally conducted during the design phase of a system. So, if an organization has an existing system and there are no changes being made to the system, threat modeling doesn't normally apply in that instance. However, if you are bringing a new system online, then you want to ensure that the threat model takes into account the new requirements for 800-171. The second part of the question is, what adjustments should we make to stay ahead in both compliance and security objectives? Um, the main, as far as staying ahead, so 800-171 Rev 3 is the current version. So as long as you are meeting those requirements, nothing really get ahead of. Um, Now there are some threat intelligence resources out there that you might want to take into account to help, I guess, fend off any potential threats, but that wouldn't impact compliance necessarily. And as far as staying ahead of security objectives remain the same. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, those haven't changed over the years. Next question. Lots of disciplines involved. Who owns the assessment? That's a great question. It depends on the organizational structure. Um, Quite often, you might have a CIO. Um, it it depending upon the size of the organization, it could be literally the president, the CEO. It really depends on the organizational structure to determine who owns the risk assessment. But if we think about from a with a RACI chart, we have responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. I would say the person who identified as responsible. Now I'm having a slight technical difficulty here. The screen with the questions have gone away. Let me see if I can find those questions. Okay, here we go. So next question. So this one says, thank you, Nigel. Oh, you're welcome. How can we handle risks that are difficult to quantify, like those related to reputation or regulatory changes? So, as it relates to reputation, it's really incumbent upon the organization to determine how much the organization's reputation means. And certainly, anybody in business, your reputation is like your words, pretty much, I believe say that's all you got, right? Um, so while it is difficult to quantify a reputation, I think it's um, pretty safe to say that we want to be trustworthy, right? So I would I would place the I would quantify reputation um, almost as priceless. So you want to do all that you can to protect your organization's reputation. Now, as it relates to regulatory changes, we do have some guidance there that helps us to quantify. For example, HIPAA compliance has defined amounts for when there's a HIPAA violation. So quite often with different regulatory requirements, we know how much we know the cost associated with the compliance violation. So that helps with those risks. Next question. What frameworks um, or standards methods are used for the risk assessment, such as NIST or ISO? And actually, there are three questions here, so I'll go one by one. So I'll read that first one again. What frameworks or um, standard methods are used for the risk assessment, such as NIST or ISO? So NIST and ISO, those are both standard setting organizations. Um, but as far as a method used for risk assessment, now while I mentioned during the webinar, during the recording, I mentioned the approach. That's pretty much a standard approach, irrespective of the standard utilized. So as it relates to whether or not to use NIST or ISO, they both um, leverage a similar approach as it relates to risk assessments. What should be the approach to selecting a standard or method for risk assessments? So again, speaking specifically to ISO and NIST, they follow a similar approach for risk assessments. But let's say there was a third entity that we're concerned about and trying to determine which approach should be selected. In reality, it should be the approach that, and I know this probably sounds pretty, it doesn't need to be said, but the one that works best for the organization. But I also say the one that the organization understands, right? You don't want to use an approach that is not clear. So I would say whichever, I'll use that as an idea. And also, whichever method, and you might want to test a few different methods, but whichever method generates the output that is most beneficial to the organization to help meet the outcomes. And then the last question is for this, again, it's a three-part question. Why should an organization choose NIST instead of ISO? Again, NIST and ISO are standard setting organizations. So it's up to the entity. Now, ISO is an international body, whereas NIST is primarily associated with the United States federal government. So depending upon the line of work, or the market share, or depending upon the location, or the organization's location, that will dictate which standard setting body is best. Now, for United States federal government contractors, they want to be sure um, to be very familiar with NIST. Now, if a company does a lot of work internationally, then ISO would be one to consider. Now, I must say, for those of us who are familiar with the NIST 853 control catalog, there is a mapping that shows how the NIST 853 controls are associated with the ISO 27001 controls. And you will notice there that the NIST controls are a superset of the ISO controls. So that might help with your decision. Next question. How frequently are the current controls tested for efficacy? With a good risk management program, an organization should develop something called a continuous monitoring plan. And that plan would dictate um, when controls should be tested. Or you can have an internal audit plan. But nevertheless, um, the organization should determine um, which controls should be tested and at which frequency. And then those that testing should be carried out in accordance with that plan. Next question. As a subject matter expert in risk assessment, should your role include guiding the client through the entire process, or should the organization itself be responsible for understanding and managing their role in the compliance journey? I will say both. And I'll start with the second part. The second part of the question, should the organization itself be responsible for understanding and managing their role in the compliance journey? Yeah, you can never outsource your understanding, right? You should never outsource your understanding. So, and it is due to the potential ramifications for compliance lapses, it is truly in the organization's best interest to be fully responsible for that role as in the compliance journey. Now, as far as being a subject matter expert, certainly I would certainly guide the organization, but in doing so, I would encourage the organization to take ownership and take responsibility for the understanding and managing compliance. And our last question. How can we ensure that the risk assessment process remains effective, and relevant over time? I think it's a good idea to maintain, I'll say metrics in quotes. Um, as long as the risk assessment reporting is giving management the data and information needed to make decisions such that the business is able to flourish, then I would say then the risk assessment process is effective. However, on the other hand, if you find that the risk assessment reporting is of no value, then that's pretty straightforward, and that lets you know there's a need to change their approach. That might mean, identifying a consultant to help, but I would say as long as the risk assessment reports that are being generated help the organization to fulfill the mission and objectives, then I would say that the risk assessment approach is fine. Well, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us today. Do stay tuned for our webinar. I think our next one will be in December. We plan to talk continuous monitoring. Thanks again.